I put you in that chair. Oh yeah, your heart meds. I switched them for sugar pills. You were dead and buried, and I had to watch this asshole bring you back. So when you are sitting in your shitty nursing home and you're sucking down on your Jell-O night after night for the rest of your life, you think of me. You twisted.
Hey, what is up? So for this video, I'm going to really discuss the only thing I can discuss the day after last night's episode, and that is the incredibly unexpected and tragic death of Nacho Varga in only the third episode of 13 in the sixth and final season of Better Call Saul. And while I think all fans of Better Call Saul knew that Nacho's death was absolutely a possibility for his character this season, I can safely say that for all intents and purposes, literally no fan of this show thought this was going to happen last night in the show's third episode of season 6. So after giving my initial thoughts in my review of last night's episode, I now want to take a more in-depth look at the storyline that was presented to us last night and really attempt to unpack the truly tragic storyline surrounding Nacho Varga's death in the plot of Better Call Saul. So, getting into the cold opening scene of last night's episode that was presented to us, this scene displayed to us a then unknown scene of various shots of what appeared to be the wilderness in Albuquerque, of the camera panning from shot to shot while stopping on two notable images of one, a blue flower, as well as a shard of glass that proceeds to be rained on at the end of this cold opening scene. And at the time, I, like all fans of Better Call Saul, truly wondered what the meaning behind this scene was, and certainly thought the meaning behind this scene would of course be revealed to us at the end of last night's episode, and man was the meaning behind this something. And so before we unpack the meaning behind this cold opening scene, we first need to set the stage of how we got there. And so the first act of this episode picked up with the continuation of Nacho's storyline at the end of the second episode of season 6 of Better Call Saul, following him escaping the ambush by the cousins and the cartel at the motel. And without getting bogged down into too much specific plot details that occurred here in this scene, following Nacho first appearing to prepare for a firefight with the cousins, he then appears to change his mind when he sees what appeared to be oil tanker in hindsight, and eventually submerges himself in the oil inside of the tanker to avoid detection by Marco Salamanca. And while this plan ended up being a success, the physical turmoil that Nacho experienced here in this scene was absolutely nothing compared to what was in store for his character at the end of this episode, of course. And so, following this scene, Nacho eventually ended up at a car service station in Mexico, where he was able to clean up after being submerged in this oil with the help of an auto worker here at the shop. And then following this, we see what was in hindsight Nacho's one last call to his father here in the series. And so here it appeared that Nacho wanted to say his goodbyes to his father, who, while clearly knew that Nacho did not sound like himself, could not have possibly foreseen what was going to happen to his son at the end of this episode. And so, following some small talk where Nacho's father again urges him to turn himself into the police and face what he did, as he said he should do last season as well, with his father being a quote-unquote straight arrow, to quote Nacho. This then is followed by Nacho, who is struggling to contain his emotions here, ending this phone call with his father following his last goodbyes, of course likely to himself knowing that he cannot do what his father is suggesting if he wants to protect at least his father from the wrath of the cartel. And so, following this last emotional phone call with his father, this scene then picks up with the continuation of the phone call that Nacho made to Mike Ehrmantraut at the end of the previous episode of Better Call Saul, where Nacho then confronts Mike for knowingly sending him on this, what appeared to be suicide mission in Mexico, where Nacho then realized that it was his job to die in that motel in order to avoid being a loose end who could implicate Gus Fring. Mike, of course, replying that it was not his call, thus exemplifying his allegiance to Gus Fring that we saw displayed over the course of this episode. Again, an incredibly nuanced aspect of this plot, but of course that is a discussion for a different video. Then, following Nacho wanting to speak with Gus himself, Nacho, of course, then reveals to Gus that he knows that he could betray him and destroy him if he turns himself into the cartel and rats on Gus. But he then says that he knows the only way that Gus survives this situation is if Nacho dies. And here Nacho agrees to apparently do this in hindsight, of course, unbeknownst to the audience at the time, that Nacho will give his life in this storyline on one condition, that his father remain protected for all time. Gus, of course, assures Nacho of this, but Nacho then, of course, saying he needs to hear it from Mike, who then says to him that he assures his father will not be messed with by the cartel, pledging that if anyone tries to get to his father, they'll have to go through him first. And so, with all that being said, this scene right here is the crux of the whole issue of why Nacho did what he did at the end of this episode. Because like he said in this scene, Nacho knew that if he disappeared and maybe tried to make his escape and live on the lam for the rest of his life, he knew that Gus would likely go after his father as punishment, or as a means to try to maybe attempt to locate Nacho via the torture of his father. Something that Nacho obviously does not want to have happen. And so Nacho knew the only way his father would be safe from all of the consequences of his own actions would be if he sacrificed himself, with the condition that in doing so, Mike and Gus Fring's operation would forever protect his father from the wrath of the cartel. And so, following this, the next continuation of the storyline revealed to us that Mike was thus able to go down to Mexico and smuggle Nacho back to the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center in Albuquerque so that he could effectively be used as this pawn in Gus Fring's chess game against the cartel. And again, while I don't want to get bogged down in too many specific plot details here in this video if possible, there were some absolutely amazing scenes that occurred here at the end of this act, which included, of course, Nacho's last meal, unbeknownst to the audience at the time, of a very meek and menial piece of chicken being eaten by Nacho with a plastic fork and knife, as well as the last drink Nacho would ever have, where he and Mike shared together before he had to beat him up because, as Victor said to him, the boss says he looks too pretty, and so Mike had to, of course, beat up Nacho in order for it to look as though Gus Fring's operation was able to go down to Mexico to capture Nacho and beat the information that he was going to tell Juan Bolsa out of him first. Then, following this, the next continuation of the storyline then continues in this episode at the same location, the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center, where we now see the bloodied Nacho Varga, who was likely beaten up by Mike Ehrmantraut at the hands of Gus Fring, being told that he needs to tell Juan Bolsa that he was working for the Peruvian cartel in a plot against Lalo Salamanca. Then following this, Gus Fring and Mike say that they will stage an escape attempt for Nacho, where he will then be shot at point-blank range by Victor while trying to make his escape, Mike assuring him that it will be quick and painless. Then following this, Mike asked to be present at this meeting where Nacho is in hindsight going to be killed, of course saying he wants to be there in case things go south. Gus, of course, reluctant to this because he knows that the Salamancas know Mike, and based on the canon of Breaking Bad, it's never revealed to the Salamancas that Mike is working for Gus Fring, so he can't be at the meeting physically, but Mike says he'll be there at a distance. Gus then contemplates and then agrees for Mike to attend this meeting. This is, of course, then followed by the last scene in this act of Nacho contemplating his own life while looking at his reflection at the bottom of his glass. And of course, what makes this scene so impactful in hindsight is in the moment, we as the audience did not know exactly what the plan was that was happening here, and we didn't know exactly what these details meant at the time. But of course, now with the benefit of hindsight, we know that these details that were revealed to Nacho Varga was in order to set up the plan of him giving his own life to save his father, which would thus be revealed to us in the incredible final scene that was displayed to us at the end of this episode. And so, in this final scene, we see Nacho being transported in the back of a truck to the meeting location, where Mike is, of course, first dropped off at this big rock, where he will watch the meeting from a distance via the scope of his rifle. We then see that Nacho is being transported to this meeting and then taken out of the van before being presented to Juan Bolsa, the cousins, and Hector, with Gus Fring, Victor, and Tyrus being present as well. Bolsa then tells Nacho that he is going to die today. That is for certain, but there are good deaths and bad deaths, and he will receive a good death if he tells him the information of why he betrayed Lalo and on whose behalf. We then see a moment of introspection here for Nacho where we don't know whether or not Nacho is going to give up Gus Fring and go against the initial plan. But ultimately, Nacho sticks to the plan here and tells Bolsa that he was on the payroll of the Peruvians and they were paying him to betray Lalo and the cartel. He also assures everyone that Gus had absolutely nothing to do with the plot. Of course, at the same time here, we see Hector attempting to point to Gus Fring because he and Gus alone, of course, in addition to everyone in Gus Fring's operation, know that Lalo is still alive, unbeknownst to Juan Bolsa and the cousins at the time during this meeting. Then, following this, we then see this incredible final scene where it appears that Nacho goes off script here and unleashes into a vicious tirade against the Salamancas, of course, likely not according to the original plan, where he states that he despises every last one of them and confesses completely to his role at the assault on Lalo's compound. He then even confesses to Hector that he was responsible for his stroke because he was the one who switched his heart medication with sugar pills, and says he is the reason for why he is in that wheelchair, then going on an even more vicious personal attack against Hector Salamanca, saying that he hopes that every time he's sucking down his jello at that godforsaken nursing home, he thinks of him as the one who put him in that wheelchair, as he rots away there for the rest of his life, saying that he hates every single last one of the people at that meeting of Gus Fring and the cartel, saying that not only was he getting paid by the Peruvians, but he would have done it for free because he hates them so much. Then, following Juan Bolsa saying, "Es suyo," he's yours, essentially saying to the cousins, you can have your way with him, effectively going to torture him here, it looked like. Nacho then was able to cut through his zip ties, which he was tied before this meeting by Tyrus, with a piece of glass, the same piece of glass we saw at the very beginning of this episode. Again, we currently don't know where exactly Nacho was able to acquire this piece of glass. It was not revealed to us in this episode, but then following him cutting his zip ties, stabbing Juan Bolsa in the leg, he then takes Juan Bolsa's gun and holds it to his head while everyone else points their gun at Nacho Varga, where a Mexican standoff ensues here. Then, following this, instead of what appeared to be Nacho Varga going with the initial plan of him making a run for it and having Victor shoot him painlessly, he then decides to go out on his own terms here and point the gun on himself and shoot himself in the head and take his own life, and thus concluding the storyline of Nacho Varga here in the series of Better Call Saul. Again, just an unbelievable final scene here where we see the culmination of Nacho's storyline, where he's effectively going out on his own terms, at least as much so as possible based on his circumstances. Unbelievable scene here as well, where we then see Hector being lifted to Nacho's lifeless corpse and having the gun placed in his hand by the cousins, and him firing rounds into Nacho's lifeless body for being absolutely irate for hearing what he heard Nacho say to him at this meeting. We also see, of course, Gus have a moment of introspection too, sort of realizing everything that just happened while he drives away. And then the final ace kicker here, we see Mike Ehrmantraut leaving the spot by which he was watching the meeting, and we really just see the look of emotional distress on his face for the true amount of empathy that he had for Nacho Varga, as I discussed in many of my previous videos. But now, getting back to that cold opening scene that was displayed to us here at the very beginning of this episode, with the benefit of hindsight, I truly believe that this scene was meant to signify the likely shallow grave that Nacho was buried in. Here following this scene, where we can see following his death, there is rebirth of this blue flower here, likely growing from where Nacho's body is being buried, alongside the same piece of glass that Nacho was able to use as part of the storyline as well. And so with all that being said, in my humble opinion, this storyline of Nacho Varga is now truly one of, if not the most tragic storylines in all of the universe of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. And honestly, before this series aired, I definitely spoke about how I thought it would come across as pretty damn dark if following all of this character development of Nacho Varga that we saw displayed to us over the course of this series, which included all of this physical and emotional trauma that he had to go through, including him, for example, getting shot and left to die as part of Gus Fring's long con against the cartel in season 4 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Something Beautiful. If we then just see him killed off at the end of all of this, this would come across as unbelievably tragic and dark. And in hindsight, boy was it tragic indeed. And while I'm still in a little bit of shock in retrospect here to Nacho's death in season 6 of Better Call Saul this early in the season, in respect to his character, like I just said, I really feel that this is truly one of the most incredibly complex and nuanced tragic stories in the entire universe of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Of this man Nacho Varga here, who came from very humble beginnings and for reasons currently unknown, got involved with the cartel despite the fact that we knew this would deeply upset his straight arrow father, who did not want Nacho to provide for him and acquire wealth via these illicit means with the cartel. And at this point in time, we don't know why, and we can only speculate on why Nacho made that ultimate decision to get himself involved in the game, despite his likely father's objections. Irrespective of why Nacho did what he did, as Mike Ehrmantraut famously said in season 5 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Bad Choice Road, we all make our choices, and those choices put us on a road. And Nacho had to live with the consequences of those choices, as Mike said here in this speech to Saul Goodman, and which ultimately led to him having to sacrifice himself in order to protect his father, which thus also really made Nacho truly accountable for all of his own actions over the course of this series. We're following him being truly between a rock and a hard place, as this episode was titled, of there being no way out for him if he wanted to save his father. And yeah, so despite how incredibly tragic the overall nature of the storyline was that was displayed to us last night, I nonetheless thought this episode was absolutely unbelievably well done and truly displayed to us an almost biblical-esque allegory of Nacho Varga, where we saw his baptism by oil, his last supper, as well as dying so his father could survive and all. A truly unbelievable episode of Better Call Saul. Something I definitely did not see coming this early in the final season of the series, and really makes me question everything I thought was going to happen in the remaining 10 episodes of the conclusion of the series. Alright, that is all I really got for you guys on this one. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm definitely planning on making another video about Nacho Varga's storyline, specifically surrounding Saul Goodman's infamous piece of dialogue from the plot of Breaking Bad that now in hindsight appears to not be what we all thought it would be following the conclusion of last night's episode. Really looking forward to unpacking that storyline later this week. As always, really appreciate everyone who watches and comments on my videos, like I said. Also, really appreciate everyone who has subscribed to this channel as well. Really appreciate that. Can't wait to see what's to come in the remaining 10 episodes of this series. And as always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thank you again so much for watching this video.